Final mic check one.
I've never seen you hesitate for ping pong.
Check, check. Okay, good.
Yeah, so we've got they're directional, so it'll be like back move. No, we've muted all the other components that could potentially do that, but it won't feed into the typically. Where are you coming from? Do you know the area still? Or? Yeah. So officially yeah, I think it's hard. Physically here, I was working for a house. So they basically all that long. So I moved back over to Western house and Coinbase here. Back there, called like my colleagues, like coach. They don't. They have some.
What is the how you connected? That's something to connect. JSON RPC. They are open. 188.
Okay, so you
Should be open.
No, I didn't. Actually, I didn't quite get the noun.
Yeah, I'm gonna move Blocker. I'm Dockerizing Blocker. It's gonna be in house next week.
Started 25 years ago. Came out of house. So it's my second stint with them. I was with them in 2006 for about 4 or 5 months. Then for a year now. Before that, I was with the infrastructure network called Tennessee. For that, I was part of I think I just I'm at a place where there's or sounds like a good plan. Go work in the house. My first job. I well,
What about it?
the hardest I thought like Gmail quota. Man. Well, I'm not expecting that. I don't know about everybody else. Yeah, but if you have Gmail quota. Yeah. It became really hard to like automate email. And, I'm privy to that. Man, something like how would I you don't know. You're in there with bad news. If you're anticipating well enough. Yeah, it's going well. Yeah, we brought on that third co-founder. Oh, wow. Is like Treasure Square and Legend. Mostly raising money right now. So, still steep then. No, I really want to like elevate it. Yeah, even I go really right. Yeah. It's like a joint vacation right now. Oh, yeah. Like got a lot of ideas. Idea together with alumni. So, he's got all kinds of stuff. Yeah, like biggest like try that hard. That means you're like.
All right, everyone, we're going to get started. All right, so I will give a quick introduction to Taylor. You guys have probably already read his background a little bit, but he worked at Square for 4 years and built out their technology and engineering teams, contributing to a number of projects, including their transition to a service-oriented architecture, which we're in the process of doing. Their multi-data center architecture, Square's first data warehouse, their first automated loss prevention system, and of course, worked a bit on fraud prevention as well, especially using machine learning, which of course Stoops is heading up for us here. So as a manager, Taylor interviewed hundreds of engineers across all disciplines and focused on building culture where both data and people could succeed together. So please join me in welcoming Taylor. So I've got a few questions we'll go through, and then we'll probably at the end open it up to the audience and let them ask you whatever is on them. Sounds good. So let's start off, maybe you can give an overview of how does Square use machine learning to fight fraud, or like maybe generally as an entire industry? Like what's the 20,000 foot view? How do you fight fraud today? Like what is the best in class solutions that are out there?
Yeah, so there's a couple different types of fraud that we would look at Square. The ID verification. So we go through the KYC process of knowing all the merchants that we're going to underwrite and bring onto our platform. And so the way we thought about risk at Square was largely around settlement. So we take those payments, and once we take the payments, they actually go to Square. And then we have a time period that used to be in the industry like a month. And we turn that into 24 hours. So we hold that money for 24 hours. And during that time, we can do any sort of risk review, whether that's automated, like manual operations, looking at specific payments or specific merchants. And then what we would do is settle that out at the end of the night. And our goal was to shrink that as much as possible. So recently we launched instant settlement, which means you can actually like click a button and pay a premium to have that money moved to you right away. And so really what we're trying to do there is get that risk assessment as to real time as possible. I timed that.
Got it. Okay. And what's been the blend of using machine learning versus other techniques, maybe manual reviews, rules engines? Like, what are all the components that go into it, and what's the right blend of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was an article written recently, and I really like the phrase that they used. They called it human-in-the-loop machine learning. So I think it's a progression. The way we did it at Square is we started with all manual review. So every merchant that signed up, a person would look at them, Google for them, look at their Facebook, call them on the phone, get an ID, all that sort of stuff. And as those humans would learn about what they needed to make good decisions, we would start to automate bits and pieces of that. And so you can think about it as like it starts out 100% manual, and then we learn more about how we can, like what types of fraud are happening and how we can catch that, and we incrementally move it up as we get more data. You want to balance paying for bad data. You want that signal to be able to identify it, but it's a fine line to walk. So we started by having some really high-level metrics around user experience. So we didn't want the negative reviews, those false positives where we mark something as being fraudulent, and then it's not fraudulent, and then somebody is really upset that they couldn't get the money that they took. So we paid a lot of attention to those metrics, and we would drive towards a certain a goal that wasn't no fraud, because it's really easy to not have fraud. You basically can turn your system off and say, oh, there's no fraud, or you can let your costs go through the roof and pay a lot of people to review that. So our goal was to march towards metrics that we looked at that our analytics team would drive, and we would use more and more machine learning to get there. and invest more in third-party data services and better models, eventually bringing like the models in-house where we could really tailor them for the use cases that we were seeing.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. What is the best way to measure the performance of a fraud program?
Well, I think there's no silver bullet there. I think it
several metrics. Like, yeah, what are the biggest ones you guys would watch?
Well, I think that the metric we cared most about was the user experience. So we really didn't want to be upsetting too many merchants. We would rather lose money than have a lot of people, make negative press about the Square product. So the machine learning, you want to think about like precision and recall. And precision means how accurately you're catching those fraudsters, and then the recall being how many of the fraudsters you catch. And it's a balance between, catching all the fraud and that operations cost. And so what we cared a lot about was keeping headcount sublinear to the volume that we were transmitting on Square. And so we pay it's a balance between dollars lost and headcount expense.
Got it. Okay. And I imagine you had to improve a number of the tools along the way and everything to look into that. Like, what were some of you advise a lot of companies now on how to build out their fraud prevention solutions. Like, what are the common mistakes that you see people making? And then, like, conversely, what are the low-hanging wins that, like, your biggest ones that you recommend to people always that they're not doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a balance of starting with the easiest win. I think the best thing you can do is use some open source stuff. You don't need to get really fancy with your models and paying for better data. I think the best thing you can do is try some of the open source stuff that's out there and see how it performs. And at your scale, I imagine you've tried some of those different things and see how they perform. I think the biggest risk that you face is trying to automate too much too early, and that can get you into a hairy situation where you don't have that signal that you're having a negative user experience until you've already impacted those people.
And in working on ML, what other areas of the business was it the most valuable? We've thought about using ML for compliance, scoring, for growth stuff. In Square's case, what was it? I'm curious.
Yeah, being able to use the machine learning platform that you build for other parts of the business is a great idea. I love that. And for us, like the biggest area of impact was that risk loss piece. But eventually we did use it for automating customer support, for automating some of our compliance, like our chargebacks and that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think the biggest piece for us was risk and building a platform that we knew would generalize to those other use cases. And I think that a really awesome side effect of that is connecting all the different pieces of the organization together, because you have the analytics folks, the compliance folks, the risk folks, the engineers, and the product people all need to intersect in the right way. And so I think that data is a great intersection for building a culture of communication and kind of driving toward the best overall decisions.
Did you guys end up using it in a compliance aspect at all?
Yeah, we did. We ended up automating a lot of our chargebacks in particular. That was one of the big ones that we did. And then, there's also a progression where you go from full automation and versus having tools to make those operators more efficient. And so there's a way where you can build compliance tooling. Like maybe this is like a UI where they have some filters and search criterion and other stuff. And you can do like a best effort with the model and then incrementally move towards full automation, but empowering those operators to understand more about what's going on. With the compliance stuff, which I imagine is like really hard at Coinbase, I was at an SF Fed innovation event recently, and they're not very innovative over at the Federal Reserve. And they talk about Bitcoin and Coinbase a lot when I was over there, which I thought was
They
pretty
say anything
interesting.
good or bad? I'm curious.
They like what you're doing, and it's definitely putting pressure on regulation to move forward. And there's a lot of banks there, and they don't like it. Obviously, it's they like their business right now where they get to not improve the infrastructure at all and have slow payments, and they're making boatloads of money doing that. So I love that there's pressure on them from that perspective. But yeah, so the regulators do care about some important stuff, which is like, the money laundering is something that we all care about. And so I think it's great that Bitcoin is like helping, and Coinbase in particular is helping the world move forward and putting pressure on these legacy banking systems.
Yeah. One of the areas that we always are focusing on is our bank partners are very concerned about like certain merchants or high-risk businesses that are on our platform accepting payments. And I'm curious, did Square go through a similar period like that, or maybe they still are? It's just always there with the business. I don't know. But how did you guys work on that if it was an issue?
Yeah. What kind of what's your customer to business ratio? Do you have mostly businesses, or is this like customers buying from businesses, or?
Mostly consumer, but the businesses represent a higher risk.
Yeah. So the way that a regulator would think about the merchants versus the customers is a lot different. So they care a lot about protecting the consumers. So they're going to have more rules there, and it's harder to catch a bad customer. But if it's a merchant, they tend to have more stuff. They tend to have like a Facebook page and a physical location and things like that. So for Square, it was all about the merchants that we were looking at. And eventually we grew into peer-to-peer stuff. But with the merchant side, that underwriting piece, that upfront decision to say you can use Square, that was a metric we wanted to drive as high as possible, like to 95% of the people we let on the platform. And so we cared a lot about that decision, but we also wanted to think about it like letting as many people on the system and then having like kick-ass, really complicated stuff on the back end to make sure that we caught them if they did something that was wrong. And so the good thing that the luxury that Square had is that 24-hour window where we could watch and see what was happening. So do you guys do any sort of like real-time, like is it a per transaction settlement, or do you guys settle like nightly?
There's certainly a delay to it. Yeah, when people buy, we oftentimes wait to pay them out, and then if it's a merchant trying to cash out, we'll withhold it sometimes for a day or so and try to review it. But yeah, withholding the payout is obviously a way to mitigate the risk. Maybe you can tell us a scary story. Like what was something bad that happened where it caught you guys off guard, or it was like a really contentious decision internally that people got really heated about, like the near-death experiences?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few of those. Like we could talk about engineering stuff or risk-related stuff.
Any of those, yeah. What was a bad day at the office?
All right, so there was a time, and this is like this kind of a service-oriented, this is an engineering piece, like service-oriented architecture, which for us also entailed the move from Ruby to Java as like our core backend. And Square had a lot of culture around like Ruby and the development philosophies that Rubyists like. And then there was a shift to this like hardcore backend, rigorous Java stuff. And it split Square sort of down the middle on engineering. And there were factions of people that were in like the Ruby camp and the Java camp. And people like engineers, yeah, they're very rational technical folks, but we're all emotional entities, and like you care about that stuff. And so there was a lot of qualitative like this tech versus this tech talk, but then there was also like you hurt my feelings because you said this thing about Rails, and I guess from that laughter you guys are having some fun with Rails right now.
We love it.
Yeah, so that also came at a time that was very momentous for Square. It was when we were bringing on Starbucks. So we had, which didn't work out so great in the long run, but we scrambled really hard to really upgrade our architecture to be like this enterprise level architecture. Like this is like serious business. So we moved data centers to do it. And so by the time we got to this new data center, the people who were rewriting all that stuff for Starbucks were doing it all in Java. And the Ruby folks had to follow along eventually. But the Java people had already made it their home and built the stuff that they wanted the way that they liked it. So like we used protocol buffers as a specific thing. I don't know if you guys use like a data format like that, which I'd be a fan of. But that the Ruby support wasn't there, and so they couldn't integrate. And they're like, the Java guys didn't do enough stuff for us, and so it was I think it ended up working out well, where we have a good balance between using Ruby and using Java still today. But it was a hard path to take, and there's no like right answer. You kind of need. It's one of those decisions where it's not clear what the best decision is, and it's best to just have unity behind a decision rather than fragmentation and like disparate thinking around what that optimal solution was.
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious, what was the culture at Square? Maybe even like in the early days versus as it grew, and what were some of the really great things about the culture, and then what were some of the things that, with 2020 hindsight, were probably mistakes?
One of the cultures I really liked was around pair programming. There's a lot of ways to think about pair programming, but using it where it's helpful, in not being dogmatic about it, really helped inspire a culture where sort of a more junior person could sit next to someone with a lot more experience at Square and get up to speed really fast. And like as a manager, you might look at like the net output of that team or whatever, and there's a lot of qualitative stuff that comes out of that. Like happiness and also like how quickly somebody can ramp up, which isn't really direct output. And so I think that like that culture was really great. And it was hard to keep that. So eventually that sort of phased out. It was still part of our interview process, but I was sad to see that sort of wane away. Something that didn't go so well. I guess around culture, I'd go towards the way that some of those decisions were made around like moving to Java, or changing data stores. That's another one that engineers like to, butt heads about, or protocol buffers versus thrift or something like that. So I think Square tried two different things, and neither of them ended up being like getting the result that we wanted. One was around like getting a committee to make a decision, and I think when you like get behind in like closed doors and then you come out with an executive decision, it's a lot harder to like maintain the transparency that we all want in a company. And the other was the single leader making an executive decision. And I think that either of those can work, but it's really around helping everybody follow along with those decisions and understand like why they're being made, and understanding that there are trade-offs, and that we're explicitly making those trade-offs.
Got it. Yeah, a couple follow-ups on that. So I mean, the pair programming is interesting. We've tried it out, and I always feel like I'm struggling a little bit to get everyone to participate. But some people really like it, some people don't. I don't know. So it kind of ties into your second point, was about like, was the team leaders making some decision? Were doing these committees, getting buy-in? I don't really know what my question is on that. It's like it's hard to get people to all move in the same direction, and there's not really just one right answer. So it's about like consensus building, or I don't know, how would you phrase it? Any lessons there?
Yeah, it's about like the process for decision making, I think. And actually, I'm curious about your pair programming thing. Like, what's your motivation in wanting to build pair programming into the culture?
Two things. One is that I kind of view it from my own perspective, history, as it's like going to the gym. It might not be the most fun thing today, but it'll pay off in terms of long-term health and happiness, because there's information sharing happening between people. So you start to learn other pieces of the code base that you might not know about. It also it creates learning in the workplace. Like, some of the things that made me a much better programmer was watching somebody else code and being like, whoa, how did you just do that? That was way faster than I've been doing it every day. So yeah, basically learning and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, I think those are great reasons, especially cross-functional. So if you have, I don't know, you like your settlement stack or your like we call payments, I guess it's maybe called something a little bit different here, versus like your front-end folks or the compliance tools that are being like internal tools. Having like big pair programming across those boundaries is super effective in terms of like having somebody learn how the other team is doing stuff, and that's really valuable as like to build an engineering culture and to solve the bus factor problem, where it's like one person kind of knows how to do a thing, and teams are doing things differently. So I think that's a great reason.
That like he gets hit by a bus?
Yeah, that's he gets hit by a bus. So, yeah, you don't want a bus factor of 1, which means one person gets hit by a bus and then nobody knows how to do something in an organization. Which is actually like a KPI to watch. Have you guys heard the bus factor thing before? Yeah, okay. It's sort of a negative thing, but it highlights something important, which is, and it's also around learning, where you don't want to have one person having all that tribal knowledge in their head, and sometimes it's hard to write documents and disseminate that information. And sometimes the best way to do that is just by sitting next to somebody. And even if you just have the keyboard in front of you, you're not typing a lot. You just get to see somebody else's workflow and see the hotkeys that they're using, or seeing that they use tmux in this way, and it's really cool. So yeah, I think those are solid reasons.
So you've built out some big teams, interviewed probably thousands of people. I don't know. How big was the team you were? How many people would you say that you were participated in hiring at Square? 100 something or more?
Yeah, I interviewed. Like there was a time when Square was growing really fast. Like we were doubling more than every year. And we did we wanted to keep that engineering bar really high, so we'd interview a lot of folks. So yeah, I did probably 300 to 400 interviews, skewed more towards the latter years at Square. And the team that I was managing was the machine learning team, which grew to about 20 engineers and data scientists. And we split that into 3 teams. For me, the optimal team size is that sub 10 number. 5 to 7, I think, is really ideal, and I think that's ideal for both the team and the manager.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and what were some of your philosophies you developed over time about hiring? Like, maybe you made some bad hires, maybe you started to change your hiring process. Like, what did a great hiring process look like?
Yeah, I think that's something that Square did really well. Our CTO, Bob Lee, came from Google and had led Android there, and so he built Square's first Android app, and a lot of his focus was on hiring and recruiting, and I think he did a really good job of bringing in that talent and setting a high bar in the process that we use to interview folks. And I could talk more about that. So like one of the things that we did was pair programming in interviews, which I'm a big fan of, because you get to sit next to somebody and like kind of talk to them, and sometimes they'll bring their own laptop, and if somebody were to do that, then I sort of expect them to do a little bit better during their interview, like using their own tools and things like that.
Thing like closing candidates. I don't know. Maybe
let's do the bad hire one actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So when I became a manager, I was really excited about like building a strong team and hiring super senior folks, right? Like that's a super senior. That's a phrase that we like to throw around. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, where if you have somebody with a lot of experience, oftentimes they know exactly what they want to do, and they're very opinionated, and they want it done in a certain way. And that can be really challenging on a team, and it can bring down morale. And what I ended up learning was I really liked bringing on somebody new with less experience who was excited and eager to learn and hadn't been trained with ways that the wrong ways. So that was a big change that I only learned through managing a team.
So I feel like we could dive in way deeper on a bunch of these topics, like the technical stuff, the management, the hiring, the culture. Let me ask just one more, and then maybe we'll turn it to the audience questions if you guys have any. I think we have a catch box around here if people want to grab that. But maybe let's talk a little bit about cross-team collaboration, because I imagine a lot of people were interested in what, was happening with fraud and ML and the various risks in the company. And, those issues are challenging sometimes. Like, what should be the priority? Like, how do you ensure there's good communication to all the different departments about what's even happening, right? These are some of the things that we've had to really work on as we've grown too. So, yeah, did you guys experience that? And if so, what were some of the things that you did to help it?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two parts. We'll come back to like the collaboration part. But so you're about 70 folks right now?
Yeah, in-house.
70 here, 100 some remote folks. Okay. So that's a great number because you can kind of look over your desk and see everybody. And once you cross that 200 person mark, it's hard to keep all the names and faces in your head, and then all of a sudden you get siloed into a team. So I think like the size that you're at is awesome for that cross-team collaboration. And most of the challenges that we encountered for that cross-team collaboration happens later on when you start to scale. So some of the ways we solved that when we started to scale was by bringing people from all the different teams together. And I think that changes as you kind of move up in the headcount way. But having the person making internal tools also working with the people who use their tools is an awesome luxury. And so being able to bring them together and have rapport across customer support and compliance with the engineers making their tools is awesome. So some sort of cadence for internal presentations, I think, is a super helpful to help build that kind of culture.
You mean like somebody internally would present on like what does the finance department do every day, like that kind of thing? Internal tech talks?
A little bit. Internal tech talks are great. A little bit different than that. So with like the risk and fraud stuff as an example, the first team that worked on that automation stuff was myself and two other engineers. And then there was the risk team, and we were the only engineering team that we decided just to sit next to all of the risk analysts. So these are people who write, good SQL themselves, but they don't do any production engineering. And so what we would do is like we had that really fast collaboration where I could be like, hey, like check, like I'd peek over my desk and be like, hey, check this out, and they got to like look at it and give feedback. And then at the end of the week, we'd had some sort of forcing function to say, here's what we delivered this week. And so we'd get in a meeting with the three engineers and then all of the analysts and then the operators as well, and we'd present what we added to the tool set, and then also have the operators who were doing it and the analysts all present their stuff. So analysts decided they caught this new type of fraud, and the operators would say, oh, this new fraud happened and we didn't catch it, and here's some ideas we think to have that. And that is great because it helps kind of everybody feel important and be connected to all the other work streams that are going on.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll turn to the audience. So, Square is a company that was very much in the public eye. Everybody was always had some opinion on it. It was like they were geniuses, and then it was all a fraud. And, even right up to the IPO, everyone is speculating constantly. The armchair philosophers.
I don't know if that's done yet, but I hope it is.
Yeah. Now you're a public company. So
right.
We were talking about this the other day, how sometimes it feels, I'm guessing it kind of running a Bitcoin company is a little bit like a public company because everyone's watching the price of Bitcoin, right? How did that affect the culture internally? People, I remember people writing bad stuff on Quora, and then there's always some kind of scandal. But every
never
tech
hear
company,
the end of the Quora post.
Yeah, I mean every successful tech company has this, right? They have like the press likes to build them up, and then they tear them down, and like, how did that affect things internally at Square? And the hiring, the culture, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the press has like different motivations than what the company has or what like a true assessment would be, and so I think that Square was overhyped at the beginning. It was exciting, it was new, it was kind of that sexy, iconic Apple-like feel, and you got to see it out live in the marketplace, and that was great. And then sort of when you're overhyped, I think there comes it's sort of like a clock that the press cycle follows, and
Theranos, all that.
Yeah, unicorpses is the term that I've yeah, I don't know. There's a bunch of terms that go out there. But it definitely had a huge impact on morale when I don't think hiring headcount was significantly impacted. It was something that we had to address. Almost every engineer that we'd interview, like we make an offer and then they're like, well, what about the core post? And we all had our talking points like laid out on how we responded with a unified front to that. Yeah, so it's a challenge. I think it's also some of those. It's sort of an analogy with like fraudsters. Like you catch a fraudster and then they go post a terrible review about you, right? So there's that, and then there's somebody really wasn't a good fit for the company, and then they had a bad experience and they write a bad post. And there's also those really thoughtful, just a true statement. And I think that both of those, to different degrees, help. It's feedback to the company about what they can do differently. So I think that it should be taken with respect. And you can learn from it. And I think that helped us refine some of the story that we had and the culture that we were trying to build. In the public ledger is an interesting point. I didn't quite think about it from that angle. That it's out there.
Yeah, and Bitcoin people, it has a big effect on us too, like how the overall market is doing. But yeah, I think definitely Coinbase as a company, we haven't really had our really big like scandal yet, or tell-all piece or whatever it ends up being. So I'm sure we'll get a couple good ones before we IPO someday. Okay, so let's turn it to the audience here, and why don't you guys ask anything that's on your mind? Yeah.
Do I have to make? Okay, cool. This works. All right. So cool. You kind of mentioned offhand like third-party anti-fraud integrations. I assume you're talking about stuff like email analytics or phone analytics, like phone background stuff. Do you feel like those types of integrations, is it better to have a couple high-quality ones, or do you think it's more important to have like a lot of small ones to feed into machine learning? And kind of follow up, is there any third-party integration that you think was like really clutch for Square?
Yeah, that's a great question. It touches a lot of points. So about the like volume versus quality sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think quality matters the most. There comes a time when it makes sense to just add more and try it out. But with the machine learning, you care about orthogonal, like perpendicular signals. Like you don't want having two things that correlate, that catch the same thing and correlate with the same thing, don't add value. So you want to be like intentional on what you're bringing on. We did use things like the typical ID analytics and other ID verification services that do your phone number and that sort of stuff. I think the biggest thing that helps Square achieve like Amazon-like fraud statistics with this long tail of merchants, which people thought was crazy at the time, was the iPhone and a physical device, and not just the iPhone but Android. And what we found was we did our own device fingerprinting with that, so we'd monitor those and had like a graph on how people were connected. And there's a third-party service, Civ Science, that does a good job with that. So a big fan of those guys. So yeah, what we found with the device in particular is it was really good at catching organized fraud, and it made the cost to commit fraud really high on Square's platform. And we would catch organized fraud rings actually sending iPhones across the country and doing different things, trying to link different social security numbers and stuff like that to those devices. And because we had that graph, that like social graph, or however you want to think about it, mapped out, we were able to catch a lot of those and know right away that this was fraud. Like there's no doubt in our minds that was fraud.
Did you guys have any success working with law enforcement to bust any of these guys, or was it the extradition and all that stuff?
Yeah, we did have some interesting cases. I mean, there was like a bomb threat made on Square, and we had to like not come to work one day. There was some cases where they'd find somebody's phone who and they saw that like they raided someone's apartment and they found a Square, and this person had committed all kinds of criminal activities, and so they came and asked us to find out their location. And so we're sort of put on the spot. Do we protect our people, or do we wait for a subpoena or whatever? And so I think we live in a world where we have all this data in Google and Facebook and all that stuff. And I think it's a fine line to walk between doing the right thing for people and there's no easy way to cut that up.
We have a lot of similar dilemmas.
I mentioned those are like money laundering stuff.
Oh, all kinds. I mean, some of it is subpoenas, things like that, customer data. What are you guys laughing at?
All kinds.
All kinds.
All kinds.
We got so many problems.
Do you limit your merchants to so for example, Square took the stance here to not sell. You couldn't sell guns. You couldn't sell marijuana, things like that, which were contentious in different states and things like that, and touches on policy.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have a prohibited business list. It's funny, the original version of it, I started the company was like, I want anything that's legal to be allowed. And then I remember we went to the banks and they were like, you don't have a prohibited business list. And I said, well, our policy is just we allow anything that's legal. We try to defer that decision. We don't want to pass judgment on their customers. And they were very uncomfortable with this. I remember I went to our legal team and I was like, all right, we need to draft a prohibited business list. Can you just make a list of things that are illegal? And we'll make that the prohibited business list. But over time, like the banks, it's really more the bank's decision than it is ours often. And so that list has slowly gotten more and more specific. Actually, I think we're trying to support some marijuana businesses in certain states. Like there is sort of a sweet spot for our customers. They're interested in Bitcoin because of the things that it can offer, but because we're always working, we have a foot in both worlds. We have a foot in the crypto anarchy world and in the traditional banking world, and increasingly we have to be more and more in the traditional financial world. Jim, yeah.
What was kind of the data culture? Was it like test everything before building it? Was data like self-service where everyone's running queries, or do you just send things over to the data guys and they give you an answer?
Oh yeah, this is a fascinating question and there's different ways to answer this as Square progressed. So when I joined Square in 2011, we had like the MySQL master database, which is all the stuff in it. And we had some like read slaves, and it was like a trigger-based replication and this complicated replication chain. People would change schema and it would break, and different parts of the business would break. But what was happening was those read slaves were being used for like risk analysts, and they would go run these big queries, and it would just hammer the database, and it would just fall over. And then all of a sudden, like we're not able to take payments because that was happening. So yeah, there's a big challenge around, especially with PII and PCI data, around who can access that, and you get audited. I imagine you guys have some sort of PCI compliance piece.
Yeah, no PCI, but lots of audits.
Okay. So there was a big challenge around how do we get that? How do we let them access the data that anybody should access? And there was a big a negative tone around infrastructure. So we didn't want to just have infrastructure. We had a team called Core Services, and it did a bunch of good stuff that I liked as an engineer, but the execs and a lot of folks didn't understand it, and I think that speaks to like both pieces. Like we could have done more to explain what they're doing, but we wanted product aligned teams. So Square didn't have a data infrastructure team for a long time, and we reached a point where it was really painful to scale our single MySQL host, and we had to pay thousands of dollars for Fusion IO to do that, and it was really painful because we needed different read slaves for different people to have access to, and those became really expensive. So eventually we built a first-class like data pipeline, and they used like Kafka to put all our events in there, and then they'd go into a horizontally scaling store like HDFS, and then that became our canonical store. And then that was great. So we're like, here is the place where all the data is. And then it became around building tools. Like SQL is really great for doing, the analysts are trained with SQL, they get it, it does some stuff really well. And that there's not parity of tool set for HDFS. There's like Hive and all that stuff, but it's going to have its limitations. And so I think that since 2014 and later, it's been focused on solving that problem. But our goal was to remove that loop of talk to the data guys. It was talk to the data guys make it so you can access your data, and you only have to talk to them when there's a problem. So we had SLAs around that data uptime and stuff like that. So we wanted to make it so that you could get the data if you were allowed to get the data. The hard path to get there.
Went through a similar maturing of our infrastructure. So I think we've got a first-class pipeline, data pipeline going.
Yeah. Do you have the event-driven, like append-only stuff going on?
We pipe everything through.
Other question? Yeah, Soups. Let's get you a catch box.
Oh, now I know why it's called the catch box.
So could you elaborate a little more about your data pipeline? So was this used primarily for analysts, or was this also used by data scientists? And also, were you using it for machine learning, basically?
Yeah, we wanted to have you have to denormalize your data and have it. We want it to be as normalized as possible and have a source of truth, because we have to reconcile our books so that what the risk analysts are looking at is the same thing that the financial analysts are looking at to reconcile. So eventually we moved to a world where we had all the data in HDFS, and we would transform that data for the specific use cases. One of those use cases was machine learning, but we wanted to have that like source of truth that we knew that was the thing. Like if that was wrong, then we needed to look at it, but we knew that was the starting point. And then eventually we built a machine learning cluster. So Square didn't have the luxury of having Amazon at the time because it wasn't PCI compliant, and so we had to do our own data warehouses. So we got some really fancy machine learning machines that had half a terabyte of RAM, and we would build sort of a custom pipeline for those things to get the data out of HDFS, move it over to those machines, and then train a model there. And so that team tends to be more technical than the analytical teams, and so they can write more back-end code to do the ETLs and then get that into their model themselves. Does that answer your question?
Got it. Yeah. So just as a follow-up to that, so was it at what point did you hit the bottleneck of using, let's say, MapReduce to extract features, but when you're building your machine learning algorithms, did you have to parallelize that as well, or was that you were able to get away with just running it in a single core, the actual training?
Yeah. So there's two parts to the training, right? There's the feature generation and then the training piece. And this is a great question because this is a notorious pain point. These can take days to start training a model, and we would watch that. Like one of the metrics we cared a lot about was how quickly you could train a model end to end, and we did a lot of effort there to speed that up. That was like getting the machine learning cluster that could train a model in parallel. And we went as far as implementing our own random forest and boosted trees and stuff like that to make that faster and to give us more control over it. That was much later on in our life cycle. And around the feature generation, there was a time when that was the limiting factor, and that was encroaching on our 24-hour settlement period, where it's like if we had to retrain features for some reason, that would be a huge problem for us. So we weren't putting out new models very often at that time, and that cost us dollars. So we did a lot of work to build those in parallel eventually. And one of the hard things that we faced there is when you're doing them with a Hadoop job, you're building our features. That's like a fundamentally different piece of code that's building your features than is actually keeping them up to date in production. So that's a huge challenge, and we thought about that really hard, and using Java happened to be a nice piece of commonality, so we could actually have the same piece of code eventually that you'd use offline to build your features and then online to keep them up to date.
Actually, Soups is working on the next generation of our machine learning architecture. So if you have 5 minutes at the end and you want to take a peek at it, maybe we can get your input on it.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Did you ever transition between two fundamentally different machine learning models? And if so, are there any interesting lessons learned in that transition?
Yeah, so I think the biggest transition was from nothing to something, and the first part was logistic regression. So this was all just we used scikit-learn And then we didn't like to have Python in production, so we did a weird serialization thing so we could get that in our normal production flow. Philosophically, I feel like new models aren't usually the best way. Like it's a good thing to come reassess that and form hypotheses and try it out. For us, we then moved from logistic regression to random forests, and those are easy to conceptualize and easy to train quickly, and there's a lot of good open source stuff around that. And then eventually we moved to some like boosted trees when we got a little fancier, but the random forests were still the bread and butter, and those worked really well for a long time.
So as a follow-on, did you sort of go with sort of an ensemble approach during these transition periods where you had both models running in parallel, or did it just go from A to B and you just saw how it went?
Yeah, no, great question. So the ensemble piece is something that we wanted to do for a long time, and we'd get some lift from that, but the transition piece is much more interesting. So you have like a model live in production. It's been running for a few days or whatever, maybe a month, and you trust it, right? It's working. You're happy with it. And then to deploy a new model has risk associated with it, and it's a hard thing to do, especially if there's like new features associated with it and stuff like that. So what we did was have we have parallel architectures. So we had like a blue environment and a green environment, and they're both production, but one is only live, like doing risk at a time, so we'd have like your active one doing the stuff that's doing in production, and then we deploy our new model to this other one, and we'd watch it for a period of time, and then get some feedback from it, and then say, okay, it's good, let's move it over. And that was really important for us because if we mess that up, if it's like you're off by one and all of your features are off and your model's putting out garbage, it's like we'd have to go tell the company that, hey, we lost a couple $100,000 today because we messed this up, and we didn't like doing that. So the blue-green architecture is really heavy, but is one of the best ways to empirically try something else in production and know that it's going to work.
So just as a follow-on to that, so essentially you're saying that it's hard to do A/B tests in a setup like this, right? So you can't really have like two different models working in parallel. So as if I understand you right, what you're saying is you are basically just storing the scores from one of your new models and just doing a back testing later on.
Yeah, that's right. We literally have them in production, and I think this is something that would eventually be automated, that whole transition. We just didn't get there. But yeah, you could imagine watching it, and as your confidence increased, like you did that testing, then you could like either ensemble them together and give it more weight over time, or just make that flip over. Other questions?
Was the switch to Java worth the trouble?
I gotta get in trouble if I answer this either way.
Just
answer, yeah.
Answer it honestly.
What's the right answer? I don't know.
In your opinion.
In my opinion. Okay, so all right, I'm being cautious here. I like, I grew up like writing C++. So and Java kind of came after that. So I like static types. That's gonna be like the biggest thing. Like I like knowing that. Like otherwise, if it's Ruby, then I still have to know what type that is. The compiler, whatever, it's not going to help me do it. And you can have your checks and things like that. So I like Java in our environment because it's so mature. Like the Ruby passenger stuff and the threading model and all these challenges that you face, like the lack of support protocol buffers and just each of those like deaths by 1,000 cuts. Where you're spending a lot of, like you can do some cool stuff like debugging live production systems and, it can be great, but Java is just so mature and there's such a great community around it. And we had a lot of great Java folks. So I think it's like serendipitous in that regard. So I really like the switch to Java because we could reuse a lot more open source stuff that was trusted and I'd end up writing very little business logic. Like it would just be use all this open source stuff, and the way dependent, like all the different gems and things that are out there, it's a lot more effort to stay on top of like what's good and where things are at, and so I think it can go both ways. Certainly, like there's one other piece is that Java naturally plays well with the Apache Hadoop open source ecosystem, which was a great boon for us. That saved us a lot of time.
Yep. Maybe one more question.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the composition of your team as to how many engineers, data scientists, and data analysts you had?
Yeah, you asked about junior versus senior in there too?
Or rather, how many data scientists versus software engineers and data analysts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there's a right answer to this. I'll talk about what we did, but in general, there was an article written, and I forget who wrote it, but I cite this all the time, where you can think about like the output of a team as like a box, and like you need that whole box to be colored in to be performing as well as you can, have like the full output of the team. And everybody, like humans, are actually like weird squiggly shapes. And so it's like the manager's job and kind of everybody's job to like fill in those gaps. And so I think that there's like the ideal team as you conceive before you have anything, like that blank slate ideal scenario. But it really comes down to like what are the strengths of your team and like how do you balance that out, and so that you can fill in that whole box. So the way Square did it was, with Square it was less about, like we had a lot of analysts, and these are people these are like the physics PhDs that instead of going to Wall Street now come to the Silicon Valley, and they do great analytics work and data science work to like investigating what's going on, and that was, I had a few of those people on the machine learning team directly, but a lot of those people would be on functional teams like the risk team, so like machine learning facilitated customer support and compliance and those other pieces. And then there's that domain-specific risk team, which had its own data scientist doing specifically one product. And so that was an important separation, because the actual machine learning work for doing it in production is heavy engineering work where you need more. It's kind of like, I don't want to say boring, but it's very straight. It's like a methodical, and you need someone to be able to understand what those data scientists care about, but be able to build the thing that stays alive in production. So what we had was 20 engineers, and several of those people also carried the title data scientist. So it was on the machine learning proper team. There were 17 engineers, and then 3 data scientists, to try to give you a straightforward answer.
So skewed towards engineering.
Yeah, it's all about the operations and production stuff.
Yeah. Cool. So I think we're about out of time. I guess maybe just a closing thought would be, you look back on your time at Square, 4 years ago, they were a fast-growing company, maybe closer to our size, and now it's been 3 or 4 years. You went through a pretty incredible experience. Like if you could look back and put yourself in the shoes where you were there, like I don't know, what advice would you give yourself? Any ideas come to mind, or like when you reflect on the experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see. I'd say that some of the hardest times when there's like a really tough deadline or something's not working the way you need it to, and like the business needs it to work, and like you look at all your friends, you're like, if this doesn't work, like I'm gonna let all my friends down. Those are the hardest times, but there's also like the most fun. Like that's personally what I thrive on. So I would have enjoyed it more, and instead of just being like, oh, I have to make this work and working really hard. That like those hard times are what I look back on and be like, that was freaking awesome. Like that was really fun.
Yeah, it's funny when you look back on it. It's always like the team like gelled. There was so much bonding, cohesion. In the moment, it just feels like frustrating and scary, but totally cool. Well, thanks for taking the time to spend a little bit of time here with us, and let's all give a round of applause to Taylor.
Thanks for having me.